already on, and our panelists are here, so we can jump right in.
All right, great. Now we're super excited to be here, and congrats again to everyone in this cohort. I know it's been a fast couple of weeks and a lot going on so far, but we're so excited and proud of all of you guys. So, all right, today we're talking about public sector. We're talking about partnerships and how we do business in that space in particular. I'll do a pretty short introduction and talk about my background, and then on that I'll invite Johns to give a little bit of their introduction and their background as well. We'll probably do about 30, a little over 30 minutes of kind of panel discussion, followed by Q&A. That said, if you do have a question, just kind of jump in. We want to make sure this is helpful and and meaningful to you guys as a cohort, right? So if we're talking about things that you guys have no interest in, or if you got specific questions, please do just jump in. So, as John D mentioned, my name is Bilali. I'm CEO of Fearless. We're a digital services firm here in Baltimore City. Our mission is to build software with the soul and really envision a world where good software powers things that matter. And that really ties into public sector. And for us, all of the innovation that you see in the commercial space, from your social media to all the apps you use to going to pay your bills and all sorts of other things, often isn't the same tech that exists within the public sector for government. So we really exist as an organization to figure out how to do that and apply that technology really well within that space. So we've been at this for about a decade now, so about 10 years, mostly on the federal side. We've done a little bit state and local, but we've skinned our knee quite a bunch in this last decade and learned a lot in the process. And so hopefully we're able to provide some insight to you, share a little bit of our experience. But that being said, I will be your moderator for this panel, so I'll try not to talk too much. But I did want to give, starting with John A, in a chance to introduce himself, and then we'll go through the rest of John's, and then we'll start the panel.
This is going to be fun.
This is going to be really fun.
This is going to be fun.
Sounds
all right.
All right. Well, it sounds good, and I want to thank you, John, for inviting me to participate in this. Is very, very nice. I recently retired from IBM. I was a chief architect for their IBM's national programs. Very interesting job, but I've been with the technology sector neither as a provider or as a consumer for a very, very long time. Got out of the service, saw in the college catalog a blurb for learn how to shoot bugs. I figured as an ex-Marine I could do that, so I got introduced to programming, and I've been doing some aspect of either developing or some part of the life cycle for software for a very long time. During my course after that college, I went to UCLA as a graduate student. We use technology software to analyze things. I was a graduate student in political psychology, and my advisor used to complain that I was more interested in the process of getting the results than the results themselves. So that's kind of a learning experience. Went to work for the federal government for a number of years. Wound up at IBM. Worked with mostly the private sector to begin with, but later on with local and state, and then with the federal government, which is where I met a number of very talented people. Very talented people, of course, was John Davis, one of the smartest guys I know. And you know that he's smart because he invited me to participate in this panel. But again, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thank you, John. We appreciate that. That said, we'll move on to the next John. John G, if you could do a little bit of your introduction.
Yeah.
All right, so I work for an international company. It's actually hard to define in a nutshell exactly what we do. We're predominantly an engineering firm, but we'll do everything from planning to design to construction, but we'll also do little bits of software development, little bits of operations and maintenance, anywhere in the built environment, really, whether it's public transportation, whether it's other governmental sectors, whether it's federal government, or working with private developers. So just wanted to give you kind of a flavor of the sphere that I'm in, but my background is not that. I came up through a an unorthodox pathway. I graduated with a degree in biology from Goucher College, and I first went into public health. So my first career was working public health and epidemiology out of the state of New Jersey. And about a decade ago, I got into transit through a weird twist of fate, and I've been doing nothing but transit for the last 10 years. And so obviously my world has changed professionally a lot since March. Most recently, I've been leading a lot of the initiatives in the transit industry related to how the industry responds to COVID-19. And I guess that's the short version of my background. Oh, and then what I do presently outside of the COVID stuff is I help manage essentially our transit and rail work for the company in the Northeast. So that's from Maine down through Virginia. And that it's almost exclusively with public sector clients.
Thank you, John G. Appreciate that introduction and your background. It's interesting twist going from public health to transit, but I'm sure we'll unpack that a little bit today.
Sure.
Last but not least, this guy probably needs no introduction. You guys know him well, but John D. Mr. Davis,
John D.
Talk a little bit about kind of your background in government and public sector.
Sure. Right. I started with the government after law school as a public defender in Montgomery County during the profile era with Maryland government and the state police and all that stuff. And then I moved to the federal government. I became the chief of the homicide unit for the Justice Department during Bill Clinton's administration. Lived in the Caribbean during that period of time, prosecuted homicide cases and ran the Major Crimes Division. Then came back to the States and really started thinking about how technology intersects with the law, and was thinking a lot. I've been a debate coach forever with Howard University and George Mason, et cetera, Towson. And so really got into the area of regulatory work and thinking about how technology can fit in. And that's how I met actually John Anderson when we were launching our company. We were the 8th use case to use IBM Watson's technology. I think we're the 8th in the world when they were rolling it out in 2013. John became our mentor. We actually, John and I think we presented to 2 different White House administrations. We're actually in the West Wing with the current administration right after it began. We were also, really looking to hide our names from the visitor log, but we've done a lot of work with the federal government, partnerships with public sector firms, and so since I had that experience, I'm joining today's panel. Thank you, Delali.
All right, well, I appreciate it. So we got a lot to unpack. I mentioned earlier that we want this to be useful. So this is the time that we get our cohort to wake up and engage and be involved in the process. But I'm going to ask a series of questions. I'd be interested in kind of show of hands from everyone within the cohort. Who here has ever done business with the federal sector before? Any of you guys?
So we don't see, let me see. We got,
not in the way that you mean.
Okay.
I mean, I've never been other than somebody who's actually going to be a service user, I guess, but not business in a business to business sense. No.
Got it. Has anyone in the cohort ever partnered on a government bid or supported a government bid before? Show of hands. All right, so we got one. And how about state or local? Anyone worked on a state or local government project before?
Technically.
All right, good. All right, so you're in a good place. So
Nika,
say again?
Nika might. I think Nika may have. Can Nika? Can you pull up on the screen? Because I know she was doing some work with the local government.
I didn't see her on.
There, she's loaded. Okay. Anyways, sorry about that interruption.
Okay. All right. So this is good. So we'll give you all a pretty good foundation. Hopefully, again, feel free to ask questions along the way. But before we do, those that may not be aware, I'm curious to. I'll start with John A. How do you even define public sector? What is it? How do you define public sector? How do we frame today's conversation?
Looks like his box just disappeared.
Oh, did he disappear? All right, so we'll go to John G.
Yep.
For me, public sector. When I hear public sector, I'm thinking of government entities, right? But there's lots of different divisions of government, right? In my world, I'm typically thinking of departments of transportation. I'm thinking of transit agencies that are governed by a board of elected officials. And those to me, when you have folks in government that are making the decisions on how to drive that organization, those are the types of organizations that I consider to be in that public sphere.
All right. How about you, John Davis? How do you define public sector and what is it?
Yeah, I would just add to what John G just said, and add in the non-governmental organizations who wound up doing a lot of work with the organizations that support sort of public interest work. And so I kind of lump public interest and public sector in often together, because a lot of times those public interest organizations, whether it's the World Health Organization or something like that, work with so many governments. So I would just add that to what John added on his list, on John G.
Got it. John A., I know you had fallen off for a second, but we're talking now about public sector. I'm curious, how do you define it? What is it? What is public sector to you?
Hey, John, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, Mohammed, can you hear me?
Everyone can hear you. I think you're okay, John. Go ahead and proceed.
Good. Okay. So it looks like everyone else is on.
Yep. Hey, John, can you hear me? John A.
Okay. Well, Mohammed, you got access to both of us. What would you like to know?
John Anderson, can you hear me? John? Maybe not.
Just as we're waiting, you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
Okay.
He thinks he's only on Bahamas.
Yeah, hold on. I've muted his audio for now, Delali.
Right.
So why don't we just proceed, and I'll send him a note and ask him to
yeah, I can't hear you.
reload.
All right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, fair enough. It's interesting how I think about public sector is I like your extension and some of the non-governmental organizations, but to me, if it's an entity that is collecting our tax dollars at any level and applying those,
you're both in
and applying those for public good, or funding those that do, I think I consider all of that kind of within the public sector. So I'm curious, right? Why even have a session about public sector? Why is it that we ought to care? I think there's a big reason. I mean, especially given our proximity to the federal government. The federal government is the largest purchaser in the world. And so when you think about from a procurement perspective, this isn't just like buying tanks and buildings. It's everything from that to pencils and erasers and cleaning supplies and you name it. And so I think there's an opportunity space here within this market to want to think about government work. I'm curious for any of the Johns to jump in. What's your pitch? Why should anyone here care about public sector and doing business in that space?
Yeah, I could start that. In our particular cohort, I think each one of the companies has a potential connection with the government agency, either using government data, actually partnering with government to bring a solution to bear.
Patrick said he can hear me okay.
Yeah, John. Sorry about that, folks. So sorry, I was trying to get back to John. So the question about why is it relevant to this particular cohort? I feel like the more we focus on civic tech, it's almost like there's going to be some kind of intersection with the government. In Nancy's case, she's going to be intersecting with Medicare and Medicaid. She's going to intersect with, so as a federal client through billing purposes, but maybe not through the RFP, but having to, get business with the federal government. There's potential connections to local. With Patrick at Super, the Metropolitan Transit Authority is run by the state government, and so he needs to be familiar with, and he's got design proposals to get RFPs and contracts with state governments, but it's not local. And then, Angel's team may be providing a solution to government to try to find ways that they can actually measure their own equity and action scores. And it's unlikely that they're going to have an RFP for Angel because it's sort of such an innovation that they won't even have it there. So now we got to figure out how to get the government as a client for her when they're not going to be an RFP. So Nika, I should say as well, with the local government, a lot of intersections from the Department of Housing, public safety, and health with blighted properties that can become a hazard to the public. So every company in our cohort intersects with public entities, not all in the same way, but there is an intersection that's important. And that's the reason why I felt it was really important to sort of nail this down. They might have thought about it before, but I think it's relevant to the business path.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I'm curious from your perspective, John G. I know you've had a path coming from the health space into transit, and you mentioned kind of ended up doing some public sector work. Why do you think people ought to care about doing work in this space in particular? Why do you feel it's important?
I feel like there's a couple layers to my reasoning. I think there's some just core business reasons, and I think that there's some moral reasons. In terms of our core business reasons, just as you guys are starting up businesses, I think your job is to follow the money, right? And I think that's where this conversation started, with talking about how they're the biggest, the government's the biggest consumer and spender of money. Your job to make your business grow and thrive, even to achieve the moral goals that you have for that company, right? Require that you're bringing money in order to grow that business. So government is one of the biggest spaces to follow in terms of that money. Then on the moral side of things, I think everybody that's here that competed for this opportunity in the Accelerate Baltimore program has a vision for their company that's meant to do good by society, right? And and I think that's huge. And government has such great impact and effect on the good that happens in society, right? If anything, I feel like that's a group that will be able to take the services that you're offering and turn them into that societal good. In many cases, more so than the private sector can. So that's kind of my view on kind of two ends of the spectrum. Business and what I'm calling moral, for wanting to focus on the government.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point you mentioned about their ability to impact people at a scale that we just can't necessarily as vendors as the federal government. I always find, and I'm always having conversations with people that are thinking about the federal space, like, it's really tough to get in. It's hard, so much paperwork and bureaucracy to get into this space. But so much of it is you've got vendors that are in this world today that may not have that same moral compass that you have. And so, it also provides a really great opportunity to provide accountability against our tax dollars to ensure that things are being done appropriately and things are being done effective and efficiently as possible. So John A., I'm curious, like in this space, I'm not sure if you're back with us yet, but in this space, how have you seen the ability for private companies to be able to impact in the public sector from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks. I guess you can hear me and see me okay now?
Yep.
Yeah, I apologize for that. Bad network connection. Yeah, so I've dealt extensively with the private and the public sector, and there's advantages to both. The nice thing about the public sector, of course, is that the projects you work on can be very, very fascinating. I mean, just incredible. The work that John Davis and I did was something like notice and comment when you thought about what we were offering to people to have their input, you know, on a proposed regulation. Very, very fascinating. You get a chance to meet some great people, and you really have a sense that, you know, you're making a difference. On the other side, though, there are some challenges that you've got to be aware of. For one thing, the government operates according to its rules, and the rules may be codified in some place, but you need a lawyer to really interpret it. And some of them can be quite bewildering. I remember in the case working on for the state of Massachusetts for the district court, where we had a great project going, and our sponsor changed, and he forgot that he had to go back to the legislature and ask them to continue the project. So even though everyone was up and we were moving along, they didn't fund the project, and it ended at that point very abruptly. Another time I was working on a project which was having a very positive impact on the security of the country. Everybody was extremely happy with it, but a political appointee came in and decided she wanted to do something a little bit different, and it ended. They just refocused the money on something else. So there's some quirks about it. But looking back, I'd say that the years I spent working in the public sector were very rewarding, and I encourage you to do it. I would say, however, because of these peculiarities, what the value you offer to the government, whether it's local, state, or federal, probably has a similar need in the private sector. And one of the things you should do to help, you know, your revenue stream and the health of your company and the well-being of your employees is to take the time to look around in the private sector too, to see if it would apply also.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I'm glad you talked a lot about some of the differences between the public and private sector. I want to drill into that a little bit more and ask anyone else on this call, as you think about, you know, the differences in private sector versus public sector. You talked about, you know, all the rules that are kind of in this space, and this is kind of field to anyone, right? What are the major differences between public sector and private sector? People would, you know, ask me as we were getting started, and so from a technology perspective, I could meet someone. We're at lunch today, and, you know, we're talking about an engagement, talking about, you know, building some tech for them, and we could be ready to go, you know, next week, right? Get a contract signed, we're ready to go next week. It doesn't work that way in the federal space, and I was completely floored when we got started, and someone was telling me that the sales cycle is typically 18 to 24 months. And I was like, excuse me, what? So everything there is long. It's just a long process. But the commercial one that I talked about earlier, having lunch one day, it may turn out to be, you know, 3-4 month engagement. You know, 18, 24 month cycle, it may end up being a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year engagement. So everything there is just really long, and it takes a little bit longer. But I'm curious for our panelists today, what are some of the other differences you see kind of in the public versus private sector?
I would just start by building on what you said about the timeline of procurements. I mean, I agree. My default is I assume for most procurements that they're going to be longer in the public sector. But I will highlight, and maybe this is something we get into later on in the conversation, but there are exceptions, right? And there are ways, if you understand how procurement works, that there are ways to get things done fast in certain circumstances with the public sector as well. And that I guess goes to John A.'s comment about how convoluted it can be sometimes working with the public sector. It takes a while to kind of get your head around all of the kind of rules, considerations, parameters that go into a procurement before you could start to see kind of the pathways to thread a needle where you might have an opportunity to get in sooner. But beyond that, I think there's just a general difference in risk. You know, in the public sector, you get a contract to do work, you get a notice to proceed, and you can have a high level of confidence that you're going to get paid for the work that you do. There's always going to be exceptions, right? But there's going to be a high level of confidence, relatively speaking, that you get paid for the work that you do. And in the private sector, there's much less accountability on how quickly you get paid, or if you get paid for the services that you believe you agreed to render. And I think, along those lines, in the public sector, what I generally find is the client will often come to you with a contract. They'll come to you with the terms and conditions that are based on federal guidance, right? And those terms and conditions are set forth to help both protect you and them for the most part. And one government contract will look similar to the next one, but in the private sector, they're going to be I would expect that they're going to put forth terms that are more favorable to them and to their advantage, and to your disadvantage. And I think you're going to need to be sharper on how to engage with those private sector clients in a way, and negotiate a contract that protects you just the same as it does protect the private sector client. So to me, the risk is disproportionate as well.
That's a good point, John. Also, I'd add to that by saying that I think there's a different perspective if you are a startup with the government versus with a established business. And what I found that was very difficult was you get into, when you're a startup and you're trying to share innovation, a new idea with a government agency, you go through this series of technical exchanges with them. But they don't sign non-disclosure agreements when you're doing those things. You kind of put everything you got out there, and you hope that they're going to, be conscientious with your information. And then, so there's nothing written for you as a startup to actually get started with the government. You're not necessarily responding to an existing RFP. You're trying to share with the government why they should do something new. And that process is a lot different. And it felt like I was unprotected a lot of the times in going into the conversations, that you have to just kind of trust that the information you're providing is going to stay that way. And so that was real challenging for me. And that kind of led to one other point, which was that there's a thin line between sharing in a technical exchange and then conflicting yourself out from being able to qualify if an RFP actually comes. And so you share all this information about a great idea, how the government should do something new. You tell them how they should do it. You lay it all out for them. And then you are conflicted out because they can't take your idea and then give you the contract. They got to, put it out broadly, and you may not be the one to actually be able to benefit from the hard work that you gave there. So from my perspective, with the startup space, it's risky, it's daunting, and at times you just feel like you're unprotected.
Yeah. John, you just mentioned.
I could
Go ahead, John Anderson.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that comment by John Davis, because we did work very closely together, and I think very effectively together. But it was a shame because John's company had some really innovative solutions, but the government, because they have this long, runway you have to get through, and they're not opposed to asking you to do something for them for free, so they could go up the chain of command and explain why they should be doing it. But unfortunately, if you don't have a good revenue stream to support you, it's very, very risky. And it's a shame because what they really need are small companies who do bring a different approach and a different way of looking at a problem. That would help them a lot. They do get kind of caught in a rut. And that's why I'm very happy to work with startup businesses, emerging technology companies, because really, if we're going to have to make the government as effective as it needs to be, it's going to be because of innovative people willing to take a chance to get in there and do it. Folks like you.
Yes.
Delali, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know if you're going to go there later in the conversation, but to me, I think there's certainly like some specific parameters that we can talk about, like things that you want to do and things that you don't want to do when engaging with the government to avoid those conflicts, right? So, if you kind of get those parameters up front, then it won't eliminate risk, but it will reduce risk that you end up in a situation where you're conflicted out of pursuing the work in the space that you're pioneering.
Yeah, I actually want to handle that after this next question. So before we get there, right? Let's say you guys have done a great job, and you've convinced me to go do work in the public sector. Where do I even start? Like, how do I get work? I heard the word RP. I don't know what that is, right? I've heard you guys talk about technical exchange meetings. I've heard you guys talk about a number of things. Like, where do you go? Where do you go to get work? How do you start that conversation to be able to drive some business to your organization?
Yeah.
Well, John G., you should probably start on that. I mean, from my perspective, guys, it is a labor to find a window, a door to knock on. It is not an easy thing when you're a startup. I think in Patrick's case, he's got a great mentor with John G., and they can sort of identify where to go. He knows he's going to the MTA. So you got a pretty straight shot that way. You got an innovation. There's so many different, from my perspective, there's so many different approaches. And the other thing is that the people who do budgets for the federal government that approve of a program are not the same people who you talk to most of the time about the program itself. So there's kind of a disconnect between those two. And you think you had a great meeting in there, and it's like, and they have absolutely no authority over whether or not a request for proposal comes out. Go ahead, John.
No, I agree. And sometimes those two people, they don't understand what the other one does. The people facilitating the procurement don't really understand what the real needs are of the end client. And then the end client doesn't understand the rules of procurement. And
Right.
often the end client gets frustrated that they can't make the procurement happen faster. And sometimes they can, and they just don't understand the rules of their own organization in order to figure out how to make it happen faster. And so I think that's tough. I mean, to me, I guess I should tell you one thing up front about me is I am more of a risk taker when it comes to business, right? And so, each one of you will have your own risk tolerance for what you feel comfortable doing. And I think that's important because what I'll describe in terms of my views are coming from the standpoint of somebody that's more of a risk taker. I personally view it that RFPs are too slow for a startup company, and you shouldn't be waiting for them to come out. I feel that you should be exploring opportunities to subcontract to people that have existing contracts with the clients that you want to target. And a lot of the clients in the public sector in various industries are moving away from project-specific RFPs. So in my world, they might put out an RFP that says, "I want you to design this bridge," and that's it. Like once you get this contract, you're only authorized to design this bridge. But a lot of these clients are also now moving away towards what we call on-call contracts or task order contracts or call-in contracts. And what these basically mean is company X now has the authority to do work in all these different spaces, whenever the client wants, right? And these on-call contracts are beautiful mechanisms to get somebody like you in the door because they're usually scoped very broadly. They'll support a wide variety of services. The firm that competed for and won an on-call contract, that firm has to already have a tremendous amount of knowledge of that client's organization, their procurement processes, et cetera. And so all the things that you don't know about your clients, there are people around you that do know these things that might already have a legal contract vehicle through which you could do work. Now, the risk is you partner with some of these folks as a subcontractor, you risk that they're going to try to take your ideas, right, and use it for them.
Yeah.
And that's the risk part. That's where I personally would take that risk. And I'd be very careful about understanding the people that I'm partnering with and be careful about how much I share and when I share that to make sure that I can have a trust-based relationship moving forward. Because there's going to be these are called, the people that hold these contracts, they're referred to as prime contractors, right? As opposed to a subcontractor. So prime contractors, you're going to find prime contractors that are going to care only about their bottom dollar, and they don't care about their subs. You're going to find, if you register your companies as a disadvantaged business enterprise, you're going to find that some prime contractors look at that as something that they have to do and they just need to check the box. And you're going to find others that legitimately view this as a responsibility, a civic responsibility to help these smaller firms succeed. And I think it's obvious which ones you would want to partner with. But that whole timeline of procurement, which in my world could take up to 2 years sometimes to go from an RFP to award. That whole timeline is already out of the way if you're working on an existing on-call agreement as a subcontractor, right? And there are other procurement mechanisms that you can look at that are separate and apart from RFP. We can talk about those later, but to me, that's my view. My view is, as a small business, you'll want to implement your ideas 2 years from now. You want to start doing your good now, and you want to start growing your business now, so that you can multiply the good that you're doing. And so in my view, you're looking for the quickest ways to get in at the lowest risk possible, and that's. If I were to give you a default assumption, like my default assumption is that would be subcontracting.
Yeah, and I'd like to add the idea of, Patrick, you're a mentoree of John. I think mentoring is a great mechanism to get in there. Now, John
Absolutely.
Davis, who I usually agree with all the time, refers to me as his mentor. That was not true. We were partners. I saw John Davis as an expert in an area that my company didn't have. And the reason John Davis got that position was he would write articles, he'd go talk to people, he'd make presentations. He knew what he was talking about. And I think what made that partnership work so well, and you can apply this to your own company, because one of the key points I would really want to emphasize is know your own company, know yourself, what expertise you have, and go there and look to these larger companies that have an existing contract as a partner.
Right.
Bring to them your expertise.
Right.
And don't be shy about it. You have expertise that large companies, quite frankly, can't afford to develop. So find what those are, find the contracts you think you can provide value to, find who's got the inside track for those contracts, and start making calls. I think you'd be very happy with the reception.
And John,
although keep in mind John's comment that there is a risk there, yeah.
And I think it's important, John. You said who multiple times, right? Like, you've heard it multiple times that networking is important and building relationships is important. And there's two types of ways of building relationships, right? There's building relationships to cheat the system, and then there's building relationships to succeed within the system, right? And obviously you're after the latter, right? So it might seem daunting to think about, well, gee, who can I talk to understand who holds a contract with client X? But this network right here, all of the panel, the network is massive that's been assembled between all the panelists and all the mentors just within the Accelerate Baltimore program alone. I already reached out to John personally, John Davis, because I was looking for a subcontractor, right, Angel? I was looking for a subcontractor to add to a team that was pursuing an RFP. And I didn't know who to turn to, but my network expanded. This is why I love being part of this, right? Like, I never would have had a chance to meet John Davis, and I never would have had a chance to meet anybody else here if it wasn't for this opportunity, right? But these relationships are so critical to shortening your timeline for determining who you can trust, who you can partner with, right? Those relationships help you answer those critical questions. And you want to be able to leverage those networks as best as you can, right? If if you Muhammad or Nancy or Angel or Patrick, like if you decide that you want to target business with client X for whatever reason, you feel that client X is the right client for you to focus your energy on, right? You know, I would highly recommend you blast an email to the people that are on this chain. Forgive me, John, if I'm pushing too hard, but like I would blast an email to the people on this chain, and I would be like, hey, does anybody happen to have relationships over at client X? You know, that's your network, and then if you believe you can trust the people that are here, right, then by extension you can have some level of trust in your connection to that particular client or whatever firm might be serving that client presently.
Yeah, and speaking of asking for things that you need, I want to kind of shift and give the mic over to all the folks in the cohort. Again, we want to make sure this is valuable to you all, and ask you, what questions might you have for this group. We got a little bit more to share towards the end, but I want to make sure we pause for a second and kind of get a pulse check in and see what questions you have.
Okay, I am Nancy Goldring. Our company is the Sankofa Community Network, and we are focusing on telehealth. And first of all, I want to say thank you so much for setting up the panel, and thank each of you for the donation of your time. It's already been incredibly enlightening. And as it relates to the on-call contractors, we're going to be approaching Medicare, Medicaid. We're going to be focusing on, initially in our pilot, the senior community, the underserved, the affordable low-income housing community. And so the first thing we were thinking was, our first challenge was getting through that process, that application process for qualifying for Medicare, Medicaid payments. However, in listening to John G., I'm asking myself, is it possible that we can somehow connect with, is on-call contracting even possible in that arena? And how do we then essentially partner with an existing create, let me slow down. How do we partner with someone who already has an established relationship in a way that allows us to be paid for the service that we want to provide in less than the 2-year application process that it typically takes to even get online? And the other thing is, if you do partner with an on-call contractor, can you use that to then, obviously I would imagine you kind of ride along with your on-call contractor, and you can still be making application for a direct line to government, only along the way you are being paid and you are getting even experience, credibility, developing relationships like that. Are there some, or I guess my question is, in this healthcare arena, what I don't want to do is pollute my mind with this notion that in this arena you wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. It sounds like the on-call contractor relationship is universal to government
I don't know if it's universal, but I'll let you jump in this in 1 sec. I'll make it real brief. The reality with the telehealth space right now is that under the state of emergency the country's been in for a long time, a lot of the rules have been changed, and they're making it real possible for companies to move quickly, to get paid quickly, to move in and provide services quickly. So, this would, I think a relationship is important, but also because of the time itself, the timing of when you're trying, you should have an ability to move through the process quicker than normal right now in the medical space.
I would add that there are
Okay.
other procurement mechanisms too, right? So, Patrick and I talked about this a little bit. I'm more familiar with state and municipal government. I'm personally less familiar with federal. But, I know in state government, in most jurisdictions, most states around the United States, you can skip the RFP process if the dollar value of what you're offering is $50,000 or less, and what you're offering could be procured via a purchase order. And when a purchase order occurs, they just need to, check the boxes that they searched the internet for other service providers and it was a reasonable price that they got from you. In your case, there might not be any company out there like you, and they check their box, but purchase orders can happen pretty fast. And purchase orders, while they're typically used for a desk, or erasers or what have you, you can also, define a service that's culminated with a deliverable. And that deliverable, whatever that deliverable is, however you define it, is that thing that can be purchased with that purchase order for a fixed price, right? And so that's a different way. It's not about cheating any system, right? It's just about understanding that there's different procurement tools for different types of procurements, right? And it would be cheating to say, give me a purchase order every week for the next, X number of weeks. That beats the intent of the rule. But if you had a smaller service that you can offer for a smaller price, a purchase order might be a different mechanism to get in, so to speak. I think there's also, once you get past the definition of an on-call, there's a whole bunch of different flavors of on-calls, and there's particular rules that go along with each of them. That will determine how easy or difficult it is to add a subcontractor. And there could be other, like I think what John's alluding to now is, because we're under a state of emergency, pretty much everywhere, there could be new avenues that open up in order to get services in the door. And again, to me, it just comes back down to finding somebody that you can talk to that's very knowledgeable in your particular industry and with this particular client.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. If you can find folks, again, you'll be hearing a lot about network. Talk to a bunch of people. So if you can find people that are in your space that are in similar adjacent services, just start picking up the phone and asking, what it is they do. Are they able to add subs? Get a good landscape of who owns the contracts, how long they are, the values, and much of that is public information. I'm probably more familiar on the federal side, so me and John G probably bridge the gap here. But on the federal side, they've got public databases that show all the contracts, who's getting them, the award values and such. I suspect that state and local have something similar where you can pull that type of information, and then that becomes your hit list of people you can reach out to call and engage. On the acquisition threshold from a federal perspective, it's under $250K. And again, this may be a little dated, may have adjusted a little bit, but they also can, if the purchase is under that amount, they can do something relatively quickly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in. So in my 9 to 5, I actually work for government, and so a lot of what you guys have talked about, I know about personally, and I was thinking, I don't know why people go into business with government, because the contracting and procurement process is so slow. The payments, I think there's issues related to how slow payments can be made, and making sure you have, resources to be able to support your company while you're waiting for payments. Reporting can be cumbersome. But I think that you guys have actually shifted my thinking a little bit through this conversation. So I'm happy about that. But there's 2 things that I really wanted to see if you could talk about that I also see. And you mentioned it a little bit, I think, John Davis, with I'll say it this way. Is there a way to sort of politic-proof your project, with the government? So I think the RFP process in contracting, sort of one thing that has a life of its own. But when I think about my company service that we're providing, I think about how, our president just said that they're not going to do any more diversity trainings. And, I think about all of the companies that might have, contracts and ongoing things with different governmental entities in that arena. And then you have your president say, we're not doing any more of that. And, those things stop or go away. And so, so I wondered, that if you could speak to, that issue. And then kind of to the point that Delali, you were just making in terms of your experience and John G's experience, like what are those differences between working with local versus state versus federal government? I see some of it in like that sort of purchase order, process and being on like state approved vendor lists that, make, and I'm on the other side of it. And so I put together contracts and I put together solicitation bids and I use some of these mechanisms to move projects along as quickly as I can. But how, like, are there benefits to working with different levels of government based on, some of these opportunities or challenges? So sorry for asking two questions.
Got it. We actually start with the latter one. So I'll talk to Fed, and then I'll let John G or anyone else jump in on anything I missed or they want to add on the state and local side. So some of the advantages of working with federal is that it is pretty similar no matter what agency you go to. They've all got different variations and little flavors of how that agency may do business or what types of vehicles and procurements they tend to like. But the entire federal government is guided by what's called the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the FAR. And that FAR essentially is the Bible. I mean, it's thousands of pages. I mean, it's huge. I do not recommend you read it. But it is the guardrails of how you do federal procurement in general to ensure that no one gets in trouble, no one's going to jail. And so that is the baseline for how all federal government is done. And so once you kind of understand how to do federal contracting, it is similar across agencies. Now, that being said, in there's lots of provisions and ways, exclusions for certain things. For example, if folks that are trying to do business at VA, they've got clauses where they go for veteran first, right? If you are not a veteran-owned company trying to go to VA, you got to get behind a veteran-owned company, right? So each agency may have a particular preference of what they're looking for. They all have goals also associated with those organizations where they work with the Small Business Administration to say we want to do X% with veteran-owned companies and Y% with women-owned companies and et cetera. And so I'd say there are some similarities. If you get into Fed, you understand Fed, it can move from place to place relatively easily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I feel like an advantage of state versus local is generally the projects are bigger with state than they are with local. And so, you have to expend so many units of energy to win any procurement, and I feel like you'll get more dollars in return per unit of energy that you spend in chasing the work with the state than you would with the local. So that's just my general view. I also view it like, Delali mentioned how you have federal procurement rules, right? Well, when you get down to the state level, you have to comply with the federal procurement rules, plus the state puts their own layer of state procurement rules on top of that. And then when you get down to the city, right, like then you have yet one more layer on top of that. And I think that's why that you end up with more units of energy spent on chasing work than you do on return when you get further down to the smaller municipal level. There's just more to comply with and to be careful of, and it makes it harder, I think, for these organizations to streamline their procurement practices, and not just the procurement practice, but their invoice payment practices, right? Because you want to get paid sometime soon, right? So that, to me, there's advantage there. I also generally find, at least in our industry, that the work at the federal level is even though there's less organizationally to deal with in terms of procurement and less variability, the projects are still a little bit smaller. State, for us at least, when we're dealing with infrastructure, which is our space, the projects are just bigger at the state level, and they're smaller whether you go up or down.
I wanted to just also mention to your question about are there politic proofing your concept. I'm not sure how everyone else would view this answer. It's hard to do that at the federal level. Put it another way. With an innovation that's not baked in already, we were talking with the Obama administration, and then we assumed we'd be able to roll those conversations into the Hillary Clinton administration. That was over, and those programs were done. Those things that are guided by executive order or by executive decision by the president's office or OMB oftentimes will change from at the innovation level. I suppose for you, John Anderson, is a little bit different when you're IBM and have a relationship with the federal government for 100 years. That kind of thing didn't happen, but it sure did in my case.
Yeah, I'd say.
Actually, it would happen with us.
Go ahead, Johnny.
It would happen. Yeah, even with a large company, it'll happen. There is this one process that the federal government does, and I suspect the state would probably do it too. Towards the end of the fiscal year, they take a look at the projects that are that are active, and they decide, do they want to keep them going or should they kill them? And if they kill them, they take the money associated with that and they put it back and they repurpose it. Apparently, there are some rules, and when Congress appropriates this money, they do give them a way of doing that. And so, if you have a relationship with that agency, and this usually happens in the August timeframe, you go and talk to them and say, "What do you think is up?" It goes back to what your expertise is and what value you bring to the table, because if one of those projects they're looking at either beefing up or starting anew, and your expertise falls in that area, you might have a good chance of getting it. If maybe you're the only person bidding on it at that point, because it tends to be very informal.
Yeah, I'd say a couple other ways to potentially future-proof or get around some of the political barriers are making it standards-based or something super proprietary just to you. And I'll give you an example, right? In the software world in which I live, there are various standards that people determine. One is called CMMI, Capability Maturity Model, and it's based out in the CMMI Institute. And what they've said is, here are the standards, or if people follow these things, we can have with some assurance that they're building good quality software, right? That gets you a better product in the end. And the industry has assumed it. The industry has agreed on it. And because of that, the government now says it's industry standard. We now are going to apply this to our procurements, where if you don't have this certification at this rating, you may not be able to even bid on particular projects. It's really their way of both checking the quality checkbox, but it's also their way of saying, we don't want 1,000 proposals, right? So we want to get a smaller list of people that even qualify to bid. And so standards-based is an approach you could take if you can become like an industry standard in a space, which I think you've got the ability to kind of grow and try to corner that market. I think another piece is by being able to have something so proprietary, and agencies are different, right? Some, they want to have copyright or trademark on your thing, that you are the only entity that can provide this thing. And what that does is that then says your IP is protected, and they can then have some more ability to be able to sole source you an award, saying, okay, this is a thing that's not readily available. You own this product, you own this process, and so they're able to potentially get around some rules with you're the only vendor in the space. So those are a couple ideas on how you could try to proof it.
I want to go back to the politics question too. I understand Trump said he wanted to end, the diversity training. I was just on a call this morning with our leadership, and it's at the absolute top of the heap for our company. And I'm just using that as an example that the leadership of any client organization, anybody you might consider a client, is going to set the tone for the politics in that organization. And I really think the way that you mitigate this risk of politics is being choosy about who you want to do business with. If I were in your shoes, Angel, I would not be marketing to the White House right now, but I would ask myself, what are those organizations that still really value inclusion and diversity, and I would be at the very upper levels, and that would become my first filter to determine who I might want to market to. And something else I want to expand on a little bit too is, Nancy, you were talking about whether or not you're going to hit procurement barriers with your business. I'm not too familiar with your industry, but I think what's helpful is to ask oneself, is the person that I view presently as my number one target client, could that change? Could my number one target client change, especially as you go through that discovery process, that interview process that the prior speaker was talking about? If you learn that you've turned over every stone
Yes.
in trying to figure out how you can get into federal government quick and you just can't, right? Then can you pivot and say, is there another client that I could be selling to in the interim, right? Or Angel, could you be selling your services to WSP, private sector companies, until government is ready to step back up and make this part of the program for government, right? And so to me, when you're in your startup phase, you have to be agile, and agile means flexibility in everything, including flexibility in your own mind on who your client could be at any given moment, and be open to that view changing.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. In my mind, there are basically two principles that you have to follow. One is know yourself being your company, your talents, and whatever, and your market, and know your customers. So you know your clients within your customer set. If you know yourself and you know that diversity training or telemedicine is really your strong suit, and you have been out there and you talk to people as an expert in the area, you make yourself available to talk to companies, nursing organizations, whatever, about those areas, you're going to find out that there are other people who are interested outside your customer that you should be able to devote that. Those are very important talents you have, very important experiences, and they're needed. They're needed today. So even though the customer in one customer set's dried up, it's valuable somewhere else. So you know yourself, you know what value you bring to the table. You also know your customer and what they need. So,
What are the questions you guys have?
You're on mute, Patrick, I think.
Before we go, Patrick, there you go.
We see your mouth going, but the audio is not coming.
Patrick.
Yeah.
There we go. Is that better? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I didn't really have
No,
anything.
no.
Just over here taking my notes. I've been fortunate enough. Me and John have kind of gone over a lot of procurement, type stuff and how it can apply to Secure. As crazy as it's going to sound, the only question I really have is how did Delilah get his lighting so good? It's like picture perfect.
It is. It's
really
like get a professional set it up.
He's in a studio, guys.
We got a studio at the office.
Good deal.
I'm glad I brushed today.
Before we go, Delilah, I wanted to just mention if we could just talk briefly a little bit about the strategic partnerships.
Yeah.
Not so much from the standpoint of contracts, but the importance of strategic partnerships around getting data and, just helping you to bring value to your company. And so it might, the first approach might not be that the government is ready to buy a service from you, but there might be a value in establishing a partnership there that makes your company stronger, or that you're getting access to data, or you're getting insights on things that can help. And so even when you don't have the contract, I think it's still important to go down that route. It's a talking point when you're in a networking event. It's important for you to have that kind of additional information to build out. And in each one of our cases, in each one of the cohort cases, there's data that's involved that you need to get, that the government has, or a government agency has control over. And so sometimes it's just for that. And it just helps you build out something else that you got going. And so it might not be immediately paying you, but hopefully it will be paying you forward in the future because of the way that you're using the relationship.
Yeah, and I think the key word there is strategic, right? Partnerships, right? And there's partnerships in all sorts of different veins, right? It could be that you've got a partner that is just helping you to beta test your thing, right? And proving some value there, and you're helping them to do something as well on there. And you may have a credential that helps them to go win a bid and you need their support for your particular project. So certainly be open to that. I'll do kind of a quick round robin to the rest of our panelists. What's your kind of closing thought? What's the one piece of advice you got to these cohort folks in this space that you'd want to offer up before we leave? I'll start with John A.
Okay. You really need to understand your value to the customer. It can be part of your value proposition, although really when you look in your heart, say, this is what I am good at doing, and this is what my passion is. This is what I bring to the table. You need to have a frank feeling of that, and then expand it out to your entire team. So the whole team has appreciation of what value they bring to their customer. The second thing is to know the customer. And although both know yourself and know the customer is almost like in the stock market, buy low and sell high. If you use those and start drilling into them, you realize there's a lot of areas that you can exploit. Like LinkedIn, for example, gives you an opportunity to expand your team, an informal team, just by looking for people who have a similar passion or expertise. It can also lead to understanding your customer set better too. When you look at your customer set, you should start incorporating things like a roadmap that takes you from when you observe and discover a new opportunity all the way until you're doing the assessment of it. Make it formalized so people understand why you're doing it, and get your customer or potential customers involved in that process too. In my experience, I've found customers are very happy to talk about what their problems are and what their experiences are. I've always found to be very useful. And if I had a question about the procurement process, for example, I'd ask them, and they were always willing to tell me, these are the pitfalls, this is what you're good for, this is kind of where you stand. So anyways, those are my two things. Good luck to all of you. Thanks. And thanks.
How about you, John G? Where's the advice? Parting words?
I'm gonna just keep building on what John said, I guess. So I think his especially his closing statement. I mean, all of it was great, but the closing statement is of talking to the procurement person in your target client's organization is. I think a lot of people are afraid to do that. I think a lot of people, like in my organization, I know a lot of people are afraid to just pick up the phone and call somebody in the procurement office at the client organization because like you don't want to break any rules or whatever. The reality is, if you open up the call by saying, "Hey, I'm new, I want to learn what I can learn from you. I don't want you to share anything that I don't want you that you're not supposed to share with me, right?" And if that's your opening to the conversation, you could just have a real conversation with them. I mean, candidly, that could be some of the quickest. Speed is everything when you're starting up your business, right? You don't want to make mistakes so fast that you're careless, right? But speed is everything. And if you can call procurement person at Medicaid or whatever, and you're like, can you tell me, if you have on-call contracts, can you tell me if you do, who are the firms that you awarded them to the last go around? What month, what year do you anticipate advertising the next round of contracts? Are there other mechanisms that I might be able to use to get new business with, right? So I've done this as a cold call in the past where I've just emailed a person. I found out the name of a procurement person. I just said, "Hey, I'm so-and-so. Is it possible for me to get a few minutes on the phone with you just to ask you a few questions because I'm new to the business community," right? And it's actually, in some cases, it's taken me nowhere. In some cases, it's like given me a ton of valuable information. And I do believe that, part of doing what John A. just said, which is getting to know your client, is building those relationships and I really think you should be as open-minded as you can about your options for doing that. I know I said blast everybody on this email chain, maybe not a group email chain, right? But like shoot an individual email to John D or John A or John G and say, do you know anybody that I can talk to that's really knowledgeable about the inner workings of client X? And we might not be able to give you the person, but we can point you in a direction. And that person might point you closer. You see what I'm saying? And if you set yourself to chasing down the most well-informed person to answer the questions that you still have about your client, that can save you ultimately the most amount of time than you trying to figure it out yourself by internet research or what have you.
Yep. Great advice.
Mhm.
John D.
Got it.
So the thing I would say to add to what's already been offered is, I don't know, from my perspective, when I started, I thought people wouldn't listen to me because I'm Black. People wouldn't, come to me because of a whole. And so you almost take yourself out of the game before you even get in it at times. What I did was I was pretty good at networking. And so I went to an event, and, one of the senior leaders from IBM was at the event. And so I went up and talked to the guy, and we talked for a long time. And then he found value in the innovation we were talking about. That led to a relationship that, IBM invested $1 million plus $2 million in our efforts in real man hours and costs and things of that nature. What happened for me was I learned that when you're going in with a new innovation, when you have a trusted partner that has relationships in the government, that really helps you to get into a conversation that you wouldn't otherwise be invited into. And so the strategic partnerships meant a lot for me. And it allows you to move. So you come in, and initially you want to come in as a sub, and later you wind up becoming a prime, and others are coming to you because of the relationships that you've established. So it just really became important for me to have partners who were in the government space that had strong ties, and then convince them to rep me and let me come along with them. And then so I was able to sort of leverage the early days of IBM Watson to get into conversations I would not have otherwise gotten into. So that was really valuable to me.
Thank you. So all for
And also after that, you went to the private sector too. You worked with oil companies, exploration companies, because the value you provided was important across the board.
And I just want to, in our last thought, I want to just echo kind of sentiment that's been coming up a lot. Know yourself and know your customer. I think that was spot on, John A. I'll just add to that. One of the best ways to do that is to ask questions and not be afraid to ask questions. I think there's a fallacy that a lot of founders and new entrepreneurs get into, where you feel like, I've got to know all the answers, or I don't want to ask a dumb question. I don't want them to think I don't know what I'm talking about. And you look at people that have been in the business world for a long time and assume that we have all the answers and we have to have it together. It's a myth. It's a lie. We don't. We ask probably more questions. We just ask more questions than you do. So I definitely encourage you all to tap the network. Reach out and say, hey, who do we know that does X, Y, Z? You're not just a cohort of 5, but there's a very massive network that you've just joined. And so lean into that. We are all here to help you and invest in your success. So please lean on us, and definitely appreciate all the 3 Johns, all of you guys, for spending time with us and the cohort as well. And hopefully you all have found this valuable, and please do reach out if you need anything.
Thanks so much. All right, Lolly. Appreciate you moderating.
Thank you so much, Lolly.
Thanks a lot.
Cohort, you guys jump in on that other session. Click out of here, jump into the other one. We got a short amount of time to talk about. Okay.
Right, see you guys.
Thanks again to Lolly and John and John and John. Okay. And John. Right. Cool. Later.
Yeah.
And John.